You're listening to Parasearch UK Radio. News, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio.
The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch UK Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised.
Talk that we had, so I'm glad that we are now together on this particular day, and I'm looking forward to this.
So we're discussing tonight that has been around in our cultural psyche for an awful long time, but actually got brought to the mainstream really by Bram Stoker, wasn't it?
It was. There was always the idea of something vampiric in our collective human closet. We called it by different names, but it wasn't until Bram Stoker actually gave it a face that we are now able to have the vampire within our vernacular, so we have the same image coming to mind. But if you would go back in time, I find it very fascinating that, one of the first Mesopotamian gods that was worshipped and feared was a character known as Lilith, which was, a powerful female entity who could be seen as a vampire in her own right. Every time and place in history has had the vampire. It just goes by different names and it has a different face. But the vampire has always been with us.
It certainly has. So this is what we're going to be talking tonight, guys. We're talking vampires, and we're going to be looking at it from ancient times right through to the modern, more sexual being that it's now being portrayed as in the media. So let's go right back in time. You mentioned Lilith. You mentioned that's where it first came from. Tell me a little bit more about Lilith.
Well, she's an interesting figure. She was part of the cosmology there of the Fertile Crescent, but she was actually very well attached to a Judaic the belief system as well. She does not appear in the Old Testament, but she does appear in a great many Jewish commentaries. Which is fascinating to see this pagan figure showing up. But according to some Jewish traditions, Lilith was actually the first wife of Adam, and she refused to be subjugated by him, and thus she was banned from paradise. And then Eve was made to be a more subservient figure to the man. But basically, Lilith just would not agree to have a man lording over her, and for this she was thrown out of Eden, and as she wandered the liminal regions around Eden, she came to the presence of a fallen spirit. Some believe that it was just a Nephilim, a regular fallen angel, but there is one tradition that Lilith actually came in contact with Satan himself. And then we also have this great, as you have stated, this hypersexualization of the vampire, which started even back then because we have this compilation between her and Satan. But as a way to take her toll on humanity, to exact revenge on the creatures that thrust her out of paradise, she vowed that she would prey upon the offspring of Adam and Eve. So she was seen as this creature that came out of the night to devour children.
My goodness.
Yes. But it's fascinating. So if we look at this even further, Bram Stoker in his great masterwork Dracula, we also see two instances within that novel where the vampire characters do feed upon children, and that has been part of the vampire tradition since the very beginning, even thousands of years before Lilith. Right there in your own backyard. I guess it's pretty far in your backyard, but the Cheddar Gorge system there, where we get our name. I think there may have been a werewolf.
That's my hellhound going into one there.
I absolutely heard that. Exactly. I was concerned. I didn't know what was going on. The black shuck is on the outs and abouts. Wow. Is everything okay there, Terry? Can we continue on this? Are you sure there's no werewolf activity going on there?
No, it's absolutely fine. We are actually, I'll just let everybody know in the chat room, we are actually having to pre-record because of the time difference and commitments. So it is a little noisy from my end. It seems to be rush hour at the airport that's near me, and my dog is having a little bit of a meltdown at the moment. So I do apologise to everybody. And so you may get some background noise, guys, okay? Anyway, going back to our subject of this Lilith and the portrayal of women. I mean, she's being portrayed as a very dark character, isn't she, Lilith? She, with the bloodletting and all that. Does that go back further to where we used to do things like, I say we, cultures used to do things like bloodletting and, stuff like that?
Well, sure. I mean, that's part of who we are as human beings. When we were confronted with the divine, we didn't know how to interact with it. And from the very beginning, blood was always seen as a very powerful essence. I mean, even in the Judaic tradition, when we think of, the great Psalms of David and the Abrahamic tradition, we still see that in the Old Testament that Yahweh demanded to have blood offerings. So this is part of even the Judeo-Christian background. I mean, even if you would take it as far, I mean, I'm a practicing Catholic. I believe in what the church teaches, but we even see the idea of blood being, center to the communion ritual as well. So even in the modern age, blood is a very important life-giving element. And the same, too, with our ancestors. And the idea of sacrificing, animals, if not people, to the divine was that was something that just happened. That was just, the day's events. And sometimes children alone were sacrificed to certain gods because they were believed to be imbued with more power than adults. This pure blood, which we also see in the idea of the vampire as well. The feeding on virgin blood is a very powerful notion.
It is very much so. And also where they feed from, which is obviously the neck, that's also the most vulnerable part of the human body, isn't it? So it's that vulnerability, that innocence, that purity that this myth has grown up around.
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, there are other ways for vampires to feed. Lilith, for instance, going back to Lilith, she was believed to what the cause of nocturnal emission, shall we say. So Lilith also was able to feed on the human essence in that way as well. So again, whenever you had said at the very beginning, the lead into the show, the idea of sexuality in the vampire has always been present. But the Victorians, who were always kind of prudish about this, really kind of put up their eyebrows with novels like Dracula. And even a little bit before this, there was a book that came out called Camilla, which is a lesbian vampire. So we do have this idea of sexuality, but it's not until the Victorian era that it's actually introduced again into our, collective imagination with these kind of works.
It's very fascinating how it started with a woman, and then basically in modern culture it's actually changed into a very male orientated persona, hasn't it?
It has. So let's look at the reasons for that, and that's one of the fascinating things about the vampire, because you can look at it culturally as well. The vampire is a very powerful figure. It comes to somebody who is vulnerable, and it basically preys upon them. And in Lilith's case, she is kind of a succubus. She has her way with them. So that is something that's very uneasy in a male-dominated society. So we can see the fluctuation to whenever the vampire is now a charming, Eastern European count. We see that it has changed. We see that now he is somebody of nobility, which rightfully has power over his inferiors. It's a very stratified presentation of the vampire. But it takes these particular cultures that has that natural stratification within its society for us to recognize such a thing. But that's a great point, Carrie. I mean, whenever you study the vampire, it can be studied from the point of the paranormal, from the cryptid, or it can be studied as a social commentary as well.
Yeah, very much so. It's a very strange phenomena because it is a folklore thing. It isn't an actual creature, is it? I mean, there aren't any cases of vampirism, or is there? Or do I just not know about that?
Oh, no, absolutely. There are cases of people reporting some sort of cryptid creature coming into their home, and I actually do cover this in a chapter on my book. Mm-hmm. That there are eyewitness accounts of something which appears to be rather bat-like entering in people's homes. And throughout the world, a lot of cultures have these legends about vampiric creatures. Some of them, around Greece, for instance, have a very ape-like creature that emerges out of rocky chasms to feed upon people certain times of the year. And whenever you go to places that have a lot of bat populations, like the Southern Pacific, we see within those cultures tales of a bat-like creature that comes to feed upon the living. So that's another good point. See, the vampire is a very nebulous type of constantly changing organism. It could be a flesh and blood creature. It could be a boogeyman. Or, it could be something completely paranormal. There's even a strain of thought among a lot of ufologists nowadays that our vampire legends come from aliens. There's a belief that some of these aliens that visit us, particularly the Greys, need human blood in order to sustain themselves, and that's why they go around abducting people. So you even have that notion that vampires are interstellar beings that come here solely to feed upon us. But again, whenever you wade into the tricky waters of what it means to be a vampire, you are soon almost drowning because there's so many different theories and schools of thought that are, washing over you.
It does change culturally, doesn't it? I mean, when I first started looking into the vampire, which obviously I'm nowhere near the expert that you are, but it struck me very much the differences in culture, which is why I would probably think if it was very unison across cultures, then yes, I would probably sort of say those thoughts. I was thinking more of a psychological thing, like we talked about succubuses and incubuses. That's a very psychological driven aspect. So that's sort of where I was sort of thinking, really, with the bloodletting of culturals and all that. It's sort of maybe it's a psychological manifestation.
Yeah, absolutely. Whenever I go about writing or investigating anything, I always look at the subject from a very skeptical point of view. And not skeptical by saying, I don't necessarily believe this, but skeptical in as much that I'm scrutinizing it from a very scientific perspective. And I've been trained in anthropology, so I look at everything anthropological first. And indeed, I find that when we're looking back in history, right before the Hellhound came onto the scene and kind of disrupted my line of thought, I was talking about the Cheddar Gorge, which is where exactly is that in England, by the way, Carrie?
It's in Somerset.
Somerset, okay, great. Well, yes, there's a Gough's Cave there, Gough, I think I'm pronouncing it properly, but there's a cave system there that dates to about 12,000 to 13,000 years ago, and in that cave system, they found that there was a lot of butchering going on there, and there was found, and right beside the remains of the animals was the remains of human beings, and not only any type of human being, but there was 2 children and 1 adolescent, going back again to the idea of feeding upon the young. Now, this cannibalization was not caused by any kind of boogeyman or any kind of creature that goes bump in the night. It was caused by human beings. They were simply feeding upon other human beings as a very easy food source. And preying upon children, if you think about it, does make sense from a food gathering point of view, because there's less likelihood that they're going to fight back. I mean, these are terrible things to ponder, but these are, the skeletons that are in our human closet. So when we talk about things like cannibalism, we do not want to put a human face upon that. So psychologically, getting back to what you stated brilliantly, is that it's easier to make those cannibals into monsters, even though they are just simply 100% human beings. And I think a lot of that stuff is going on with the idea and the creation of vampiric legends, especially whenever we look at like Vlad the Impaler, or we look at Madame Bovary a little bit later on. We see that these people, these are human beings that are transformed into creatures because we simply cannot accept them as flesh and blood human beings.
Because they don't fit the social norm that we know, they don't live by the moral standards that we are brought up in, regardless, through church or, through your society,
right?
Whatever point there is in history.
Yeah. Now, Vlad, who died in about 1477, that fluctuates every now and then because nobody exactly knows the exact date whenever he died. But about 1477 is a good time. But, people in Romania saw him as almost a George Washington figure. He was able to save his people from the Turks. Even the Pope, gave him a commendation for his heroism against the infidels. But when we look at him from the 21st century and say, how can a man do such a thing? He becomes very, he becomes a villain. But in actuality, he was not a villain. He was a person of his particular day and age. And, one of the to, have psychological warfare waged against your enemy is by having deterrence. And one of the best deterrents was having, a forest of impelled people as the Turks entered a certain territory. And he was just a man of his time, but we don't accept that nowadays. And Bram Stoker even alluded to that. So even when we're talking about the turn of the 20th century, that was still something that left the human being aghast. But if we would go back in time to 1477, that would be something that would have been fairly common at that particular time period. But, even though we can't grasp that now, his humanity has been stripped away, and he has been made more monster than man.
Well, I have to say, knowing a little bit about Vlad, I would say that's probably correct, because some of the acts he did were incredibly extreme. But take it out of context of his, you're taking it out of context at the time. And perspective, from his people's perspective, he probably was doing a great thing. And, from everybody else's perspective, he's, like you say, he's come across as a complete monster.
That's right. Yeah, it's very interesting that you did bring up the subject of psychology, because I think whenever we deal with the paranormal, a lot of people do throw away the other sciences and don't really try to apply it to this. But I think that it's necessary to apply all of our sciences to what we call the paranormal, especially psychology, because the thing about Vlad, just to deal on this character a little bit more, because he's really the character that first comes into mind whenever we think of the modern day Dracula. Even his name is where it derived from. But he was basically a boy whenever his father gave him for ransom to the Turks as a surety of some sort of peace agreement. And this was a boy that lived within or around Turkish troops for a number of years. And as I was researching this book, I came across account after account of the terrible things that the troops had done to this poor little boy. We have to think that Vlad at one time was an impressionable youngster, and there was there was a great amount of theorized notions of child abuse inflicted upon this person. And one of the prevailing theories out there is the reason why Vlad employed impaling was because the staff would be inserted in the anal cavity and would be exited through the mouth. And that could be a rather Freudian commentary on the things that happened to that poor kid while he was under the Turkish rule. So if we think in that regard, we can see that, there might have definitely been a method to his madness. So, I think that's one of the reasons why whenever you really start, again, to use a pun, when we start really digging up the grave of the vampire, we find that it's not quite as tidy as we might have thought that it was, And again, these are people inflicting this terrible grief upon people. We're not quite up to monsters yet. This is man's inhumanity to man.
Very much so. I mean, he was an actual historical character, but that was the inspiration for Bram Stoker's novel, wasn't it?
It was, absolutely. Even the name Dracul. Although I do want to point out, there is a fairy creature in Ireland, Bram Stoker's homeland, that has the same sound as Dracula. It's spelled various ways, so it's not spelled like the traditional Dracula, but it comes out as in pronunciation as Dracula. And this was a fairy that was believed to feed upon the blood of travelers on the back roads in the countryside. So it's very interesting to see that Stoker possibly was playing on two very different traditions, but absolutely we see whenever the introduction of Dracula opens up that we do see the references to Vlad the Impaler, and even Renfield within the book actually makes direct, or not Renfield, what's his name? Van Helsing makes direct allusions to Vlad the Impaler as well. But Vlad is very much a creature of the early Renaissance. But when we get it further into the Renaissance, into 1614, and this is right before Shakespeare died. So I mean, we're talking about a very enlightened world. We have the character of Elizabeth Bathory, and this was in Hungary, and her family, interestingly enough, was right next door to Transylvania. So there's all this Transylvania tie-in. But she holds the Guinness Book of World Records for being the woman who was noted to have killed the most people. She was a serial killer. She either killed directly or had killed about 650 people. And again, when we talked about social stratification, she was of the royal family, and she was preying upon the peasants because she thought that it was just something that she could do because of her station in life. But she would kill these young women, and she bathed in their blood because she thought that the blood of virgins would provide her with everlasting youth. But she went about the killings of these people in torturous ways. These people were simply not killed. They were sometimes burned to death, and there was, terrible amounts. And in detail, if anybody would care to read about it in my book on vampires, I go into some of the detail. But, this was a torture type of situation in order to obtain this blood.
She is a very dark character. If you don't know about her, then I do suggest you get a copy of Ronald's book. When's it released? I thought it was only released in America at the moment.
Oh, no. You folks, actually, it's actually released through the Center of Fortean Zoology. So actually, the publisher is out of Devon, England. So, you can actually get it there in the good old UK right now.
Ah, brilliant. Oh, didn't know that.
Yes. So you can go to Amazon, or you can ask at your local bookstore. If they don't have it, say, hey, you got to get Ron Murphy's books into this bookstore, and that might help me out as well too. But yeah, you can also go onto the Center for Fortean Zoology website directly and order it from there as well.
Oh, that's brilliant. And this is a subject that he's written about, which is why we're talking about it tonight. It's such a fascinating subject, and it really is a multi-layered subject, isn't it? Because talking about that lady, she is absolutely horrific what she did, but she almost had a compulsion and a belief that the blood would make her younger, didn't she?
She did. And again, this is not coming out of a vacuum. She is aware that there is this tradition around the world that blood indeed is infused with some sort of power to sustain life. So, we have this, she is a lineage of the vampire, whether she's not an actual vampire, but she's in the lineage of that, believing that the blood would be able to give her powers that she normally would not have.
Now, this thought that blood gives you power and, you know, regenerative powers. I don't know if I said that word right, but, you know, those sort of things. Again, that's been something that has been in our cultural psyche for generations, hasn't it? For eons.
It has. Yeah, even when we go back, if we go back in time and we visit that Cheddar Gorge site, you know, going back 13,000 years. Another interesting thing about that site there, Carrie, was archaeologists were able to uncover some goblets there, some drinking goblets, and they were actually fashioned out of human skulls. And inside those human skulls was remnants of blood. So even going back that far, even though these people were being eaten, their blood was also being consumed for what I believe not only nutritional properties, but also because it was believed to give the one that was drinking it life.
Yeah. I mean, even in today's society, when you look at something like black pudding or something like that, that's used from the blood of the animal that you've killed. It's made predominantly with the blood and stuff like that, isn't it? So although we aren't doing it with humans, we still ingest, I suppose, blood. And when you think of steak, when people have steak, some people have it incredibly rare, and it's quite gruesome at times.
That's right. Yeah, I've seen some bloody steak on a plate where I was expecting to hear the animal moo whenever they put the knife into it.
Yeah.
But even looking at this from a medical perspective, when we think of things like blood transfusion that's used every single day, that idea of blood being taken from one person and given to another person to make them healthy. I mean, that's even part of who we are fundamentally to even this very day, and it's just done, in the medical field.
Exactly. It's still, like I say, when you start breaking it down and start looking at it, this blood thing is actually still quite around, really. It is.
And it's in every myth and legend of the vampire around the world. There is always that element of this creature feeding upon the blood or the flesh of the living. Without the vampire, we also couldn't have the zombies. That's the other thing, too. Vampires, especially in the Greco-Roman world, they were seen almost the way we would view zombies now, something that would rise up out of the grave. Even in the Muslim tradition, you have this character of the jinn, which is kind of an animistic nature entity that is sometimes able to, possess the body of the recently deceased and resurrect it to feed off of the living. So, we have that idea of regeneration. We have that idea of the dead coming back to life through, through outside powers.
Yeah, I do love a zombie. I'm not going to lie.
That's but zombies are, the way we think of zombies, like the Night of the Living Dead, which actually is in my backyard. I'm about 30 miles away from where they shot the original Night of the Living Dead. So that's a very Pennsylvania thing. It's like really our claim to fame around here in the monster world. But the idea of the zombie doesn't go back very far in the way we classically think of the zombie, possibly to Haitian voodoo roots. But the way we look at zombies now is a reflection on the way other cultures looked at vampires. So there's that kind of change and usurpation of the zombie for what vampires were suspected of doing back in the Greco-Roman world, up actually indeed through the Renaissance period. Actually, we can take that even further. Let's look at a case, if we could, to go off on a little tangent here. There was a case in Exeter, Rhode Island, of a young girl named Mercy Brown, and she died of tuberculosis. But at that time, tuberculosis was called consumption because it looked as if something was consuming the body. So to go right back into the whole idea of the vampire mythos, it looked as if the human body was being preyed upon by an unseen force. So what happens is poor Mercy Brown dies, and her brother immediately gets sick afterwards. Of course, people not knowing about the spread of disease suspects that something is indeed consumed.
So am I. This is a subject
That she was buried in near freezing temperatures, and the ground probably acted as a bit of a refrigeration for the body. But no, this was definitive proof that she indeed was rising out of the grave and feeding upon members of her family, and her brother was near death. So they did what any normal person would do. They removed the heart of his daughter. They burned it, made it into a mixture, put it into a water goblet, and had the brother drink it, hoping that this indeed would keep Mercy Brown at bay forever. Needless to say, the brother did die a short time later, and that little folk remedy did not work out. But the most interesting thing about Mercy Brown to me is whenever it took place. This took place in 1892. So this took place well after our Civil War. To put this in perspective to any of our American listeners out there, and some of you British listeners as well too, professional baseball was being played earlier than 1892. This is not some, old-fashioned type of thing that was going on in like 1692 around Salem. This was in a very industrialized world when people still thought that there were vampires coming out of the grave. So this Mercy Brown case ignited a vampire scare throughout New England. So you had graves being torn up and heads being cut off and put between the legs of the deceased so the deceased couldn't rise up. So you had this very real fear right around the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, which astounds me.
That's a lot more recent than I would have thought, to be fair.
Whenever I was doing this book, Carrie, I thought the exact same thing. But, 1892 was the case of Mercy Brown. And that is really one of those things that really stuck with me. Now, of course, America is a nation of immigrants. So we are bringing with us all of our folk traditions. There's a lot of, Eastern European traditions. I'm of Irish background, so of course we would have brought Irish traditions as well. But we can see that the vampire came across on the boats as well. And this is how it was done in Europe, and this is indeed how it was to be done in America as well.
Well, on that note, we need to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to continue talking all about vampires. And we're going to have a look at some of the traditions that surround vampires and also, and bring it more modern, I think. Do you not think, Ronald? Should we bring it more into the modern world?
I think we can bring it right into the modern world, Carrie.
We'll be right back after this.
Hello, Harry Price here. Good evening. If there's nothing myself and everybody else enjoy here on the other side more is the sit back and relax and listen to Parasearch Radio with its paranormal news, views and reviews from across the UK and beyond. Make sure to find out more about them on Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web, whatever they are, to keep up to date with all their broadcasts throughout the week. And I hope you enjoy them as much as we do over here. Hello? Is anybody there?
Welcome back, everybody. You are listening to the Dark Mirror Show. I am Kerry Greenaway. Tonight we are talking with Ronald Murphy all about vampires. And Ronald has written a book on this very subject. And it is an absolutely fascinating subject and goes back right through our culture. Now, we've discussed quite a bit of cultural references before the break. And we actually got to 1892, is that right?
Garlic can naturally lower blood pressure. Now, I'm sure the ancients didn't know that, but it's still kind of interesting to think that garlic can affect the blood, and that's also tied in with a vampire. But as I was doing the research on this book, and the research was quite in depth because I had to go a lot of different routes with this. You can't just simply look up garlic and vampires. You have to go into the medical field. But I found out that in Egypt, that also has a vampire tradition of a creature that feeds upon newborn babies. So like Lilith, The Egyptians as well had this idea of a vampire that fed upon the children. Now, a couple reasons for this is without medical knowledge of sudden infant death syndrome, a child that just seemingly dies for no reason could be perceived as being preyed upon by some creature that came in during the night and took that child's life force. That's completely understandable. And also malnutrition was another thing. Whenever you think about no kind of supplemental formula, breastfeeding was absolutely important. And I found out through medical textbooks that the ancient Egyptians would sometimes use garlic to stimulate a newborn to eat. Now, once a newborn eats, the idea that it's being, fed and it will be able to grow and it's getting in all the necessary nutrients to keep it healthy, that's a vital part of a newborn. So I personally think that the idea of garlic is tied in with this ancient Egyptian and this ancient Near Eastern use of the herb in order to start a newborn into breastfeeding. And it would seem that a newborn that is breastfeeding was not being attacked by the creatures of the night, so then they would have garlic associated with that. I think that's a very interesting thing. That's the first time that I had ever read that before, so that's my little 2 cents, and maybe there is. I hope some of our listeners will maybe get in touch with us to see what they have to say about that as well too. But I think going back, at least the Egyptians, we have the idea that garlic can keep these spirits away. But when we go back to Lilith, even before the idea of putting a crucifix up in your house to keep the vampire at bay, people in Mesopotamia were putting prayer they're called prayer bowls, but they're basically at least small little saucer-shaped items that had magical incantations inscribed upon them. And they were put up on the walls, and it was, basically exorcisms to drive Lilith out of the house. So from the very beginning, we see that people are using these kind of totems against and charms against Lilith, and they were using herbs against these other creatures of the night, these other vampiric creatures. And Egyptians would also take magical amulets and hang them around where the baby slept, hoping to keep their idea of the vampire away as well. But the idea of the stake through the heart doesn't happen until much later, the time whenever Christianity is really catching on, and the idea that the wood represents the cross of Christ, I think, is not lost in translation, that the wood is impaling the vampire to the ground. But before that, we see evidence even in the Christian society like Italy in the Renaissance, right around again the time of William Shakespeare. There's a famous archaeological evidence that there was a vampire believed to be an earth, as the dog attacks again. But in lieu of a stake, you could also put a rock into the mouth of the vampire, and that would prevent it from rising up and using its teeth to feed off of the living. So we do have archaeological evidence of burials with stones wedged in the mouth of the skulls as well.
Oh, I've not heard of that one before.
Yeah, well, if we would go back even to the Neolithic, we find evidence of post-mortem savagery done on the bodies. There was one particular site where all the heads were crushed in at a particular burial site for whatever reason. So when we think of, the way to get rid of zombies now in the 21st century is by crushing in their skulls, apparently our Neolithic ancestors thought that was the way to do it as well. The head always was a very important part of the human body, and there's a famous site also in Italy, but this goes back to the Neolithic as well, that in a particular cave there is a single human skull laid on the ground, and around that skull is a palisade of stones. So it appears to be that skull, whoever that skull belonged to, was wanting to be kept away from, other human beings. So they kind of fortified it and fenced it off from the rest of the living.
Wow. As I say, that's not something I've actually come across before now. I mean, obviously, I've heard about the stake through the heart, and I've heard of the garlic and the crucifix, right, obviously. But there is also a... sorry, bear with me. Like I say, I'm so sorry. It's all a bit manic in my house at this moment in time. There is also those... Isn't it silver as well? I know that's werewolf as well, but I thought silver was supposed to be detrimental to the vampire.
This is a good point, Carrie. As somebody that researches the fairy realm a lot, and that's really one of my interests, we see with the idea of the vampire and fairies with a lot of similarities. Now, one of the ways to keep fairies at bay is by the use of silver. That is an element that's very associated with the moon, and by extension, the moon is associated with creatures of the night. So silver is something used to keep these certain creatures away. But yes, that's a great point, that you could use silver. Vampires were also believed, like certain forms of fairies, that they were unable to cross moving water. So if you would keep moving water between you and the vampire, you were safe. Also, there was the belief that a vampire had the almost obsessive compulsive need to count things. So you could throw out, like some people would throw out rice or barley seeds or what have you, and the belief that the vampire would have to count these seeds all night long, instead of coming in and feeding upon you. So that was another belief. There was also a belief that it would have to undo knots. That's also a fairy tradition, that the idea of fairies tying and untying knots. But yeah, it's not really cut and dry. There's a lot of ways to keep the vampire out of your home. One of the easiest ways to keep the vampire out of your home is simply do not invite it into your house. Now, there's a lot of psychological reasons behind this. I think whenever you invite a stranger into your home, you're opening your home up to disease. And a lot of times the idea of disease was personified as a vampire because it wasn't explained in any other way. Something entered a house, and soon, especially in the case of the plague, people were starting to bleed out of different orifices and everything. So it did indeed look like somebody was preying upon them and had a lust for human blood. But I think the idea of inviting a vampire into your house and not inviting a vampire into your house comes from the tradition to keep people that you don't know out of your house, so they don't bring any kind of infection within your doors.
I remember that from the Lost Boys.
Yes, and that's another good point too. And that's actually one of my favorite vampire shows. The media, movies definitely informs us what the vampire is about in our collective unconscious now in the 21st century. So whenever we close our eyes and we think of Dracula, we think of Bela Lugosi, or we think of Frank Langella. And I think some people are starting to think of Gary Oldman a little bit, but every generation will have its particular idea of a vampire. But when you talk about those classic 1980s movies like The Lost Boys, that is a great thing to mention, because the 80s had a lot of classic vampire movies, and one of the movies was also, and it was filmed in England, it was called Life Force. I don't know if you remember that, but that is about a character played by Steve Railsback. He was an astronaut, and they found an orbiting satellite that contained the bodies of these aliens who were vampires. So one particular actress walked around the movie completely naked the entire time, and we also have this idea of sexual energies and everything implied within that movie. And these vampires came to Earth to suck the life force out of people, hence the name. But I think it's not until after this movie comes out that people start thinking of aliens as vampires that come to feed off of human blood. So I think that the media and motion pictures inform us even though it doesn't pertain to actual traditions and legends found throughout the world. But for those people that have read Bram Stoker's Dracula, and I was a literature major in college for my undergraduate degree, very rarely do I ever see a book that is bested by a movie. The books are usually always better. But in the case of Bram Stoker's Dracula, I do have to say that the most recent incarnation of this particular book is far superior than the book itself. The book does have problems. It is rather long. It is rather wordy. But the Gary Oldman Bram Stoker's Dracula is truly my favorite film version. Now, what about you, Carrie? Let me ask you, in your infinite knowledge of the vampire on film, what is your favorite one?
I like Interview with a Vampire.
Right. So, okay. Now, I watched this the other day, as a matter of fact, because I assumed that we were going to be talking about this at some point in our conversation. So I kind of So what about that movie did you like? Now, there was parts about it I did like, but what really got you as a viewer and a consumer of that movie? What really stuck to you regarding that movie?
I think what it did for me, bearing in mind up to that point, I think it humanized vampires. It made them have emotion, which up to that point, from what I've seen, obviously, they have been very monsteric. Do you know what I mean? Even the Gary Oldman character, he was very self-serving, and I think Interview with the Vampire actually showed a very human side. I mean, it took a lot further into humanity, humanitarianism in regards to when you look at the Twilight movies. But that particular movie where he was sitting down, he was talking about his journey through from being human, being turned, and then his thoughts and emotions being a vampire. That's what that movie did for me.
And you know what? That's a great point. And I'm glad that you mentioned Twilight, because I don't think you could have had Twilight without Interview with a Vampire. What you said is definitely the pervasive reason why I think that these movies are popular, even though I didn't care much for the acting with Interview of the Vampire, and I really do not like the Twilight series at all. But it definitely puts a human face on these creatures. They're not really monsters, are they? They are victims of circumstance. Mm-hmm. And they could also show to those people that are viewing it that we ourselves could become, a vampire if, an unnecessary occurrence arose, right? We are those creatures. So let us not make them into monsters, because these monsters are us, just by one little slip up, we could become what they are. And I think that there is, to go into the idea of the modern vampire now, New Orleans is, a part of our country that has a lot of clubs just designed to fit people that identify as vampires. New York City as well, and a lot of these clubs are rather fetish clubs. There's a lot of sexual overtones for this. In doing my book, I got to interview somebody that considered themselves a blood host for vampires. So you could go on to a lot of different.
I'm not a psychologist at all in any way, shape, or form, but I would also say in today's society we are very controlling as people. We have to be very controlled with time management, with our work. There's, in a very professional way. And to be submissive by giving your blood, or the other side of it, trying to get that form of control by sucking at the blood, it's almost that factor as well, which is why there's this rise, like you say, in clubs. And, I mean, even in the UK, we have an underground movement of vampirism. You can buy fangs and things like, properly fitted fangs and stuff like that. It's quite a cultural thing. Not cultural, that's not a word. Sect. It's almost like it is a thing, isn't it? It's almost like a fashion.
It is, in my book, I describe it as a subculture because it is indeed a subculture. It is regular people who are leaving their 9-to-5 jobs and imagining themselves as something, other than they're not. They're stepping outside of themselves. And that is, and I think a sect is a good thing to look at as well, too, because there's almost a quasi-religious attitude towards this as well. And people are submissive, but they are submissive on their own accord. They are allowing themselves to be taken over by somebody else. And people that do this claims there's an absolute freedom in this. There's a very defining aspect, a liberating aspect in giving yourself over to somebody like that. I'm not sure if that's really my thing, but there is a tempting element to this if people would step outside of themselves for a second and see why people do these particular things.
Yeah, I think you have to have a very specific mindset. But again, if you look at it from a sexual point of view, the submissive dominatrix situation comes into play as well. And when you add that level of the blood factor, which puts you in that incredibly vulnerable situation or powerful situation, depending on whether you're taking or giving, it really does link into this psyche of the vampire.
Oh, yes, it does. It does. Yeah, anytime blood is shed, that's a perfect point there, Carrie, and I think that we really should focus on that. Anytime you're willingly allowing yourself to be bled by somebody else, you're putting your life in that person's hands because, these people do get blood from biting, but a lot of times it's used through razor cuts or through knife cuts and things. So somebody really has to trust that other person, and I think that is the thing. There is a sexual element as well to it, but there's also a very intimate level of trust and a very intimate level of submission that we really don't see in any other facet of society.
No, you don't see it. Very, very rarely do you see it. And like you say, it's a very intimate, very personal, very trusting situation that you're putting yourself into if you go down that road.
Right. Yeah. I think that I probably have a hard limit though against bloodletting or blood consuming. I think that's going to be my hard limit. I mean, I do find a lot of aspects of this extremely interesting and very tantalizing. But there's some things I don't think that I could actually break out of my rather Victorian demeanor and give myself into that. So I don't think that's really my thing.
No, I have to say, I don't really think it's my thing either.
Just
putting that out there.
Yeah, that's actually good to know because if I ever go over to the UK, I know now not to invite you to a vampire club.
No, please don't, because that would be a definite no, thank you. my very British. Oh, I don't think so. No, thank you. Would come out very kind, but no.
That's a great point, though. That's a great point because we still have this. We're still controlled. We are creatures of the past. We're controlled by what our mother did or what our grandmother did. So we still have these very Victorian value systems predominant both in the United States and in the United Kingdom. And there are some people that just say, hey, I am going to shrug this off and I'm not going to listen to this anymore. And that's a very powerful, very, that's almost like an anarchy statement that they're saying that we're not going to take it anymore. And they formed their own little cult and they're now identifying themselves not so much as human, but as vampires. And I think that that's just to say, that's a commentary on the times that we live in.
Yeah, I agree. Is there an actual medical reason why a person would lust for blood?
Well, the idea of porphyria, which is a lot of people say is the cause of vampirism, or the one of the legends that gave us the idea of how a vampire works, doesn't really not necessarily has an idea of needing to consume blood in it. Now, there is elements where it needs certain types of minerals, and the blood may be able to provide a person suffering from porphyria with that particular mineral. But one of the things that is the overriding reason why porphyria is believed to fill into the vampire legend is that there's an aversion to sunlight. And it's not until very late in the vampire tradition that you have the idea that a vampire simply cannot go out in daylight. Now, vampires have always been creatures of the darkness, but that doesn't mean that they would die in the sunlight. So the idea of the medical condition known as porphyria, I think, adds more into the vampire tradition and the mythos, because they have there's a medical reason why the sufferer of this disease cannot go out in the light. It's very affects their skin very, very quickly. But the idea of consuming blood is not a great nutritional food source, So, there may have been a time whenever the human body could, adapt to it or needed it for some reason. But the idea of blood as nutrition is one of those things that we really don't find. So I think we can actually rule out porphyria and the need for blood drinking.
Oh, I see. Because that was one other thing I was thinking of, possibly, as to what draws people into this kind of lifestyle.
Yeah. But you do have people nowadays eating all. I mean, there's a famous syndrome called pica, where people have to eat things that are inedible in order to get certain minerals out of them. So you have people eat things like cigarette butts and such. So there may have been a time, that people were taking blood because it provided a certain chemical or a certain element that they so needed. So it might have fed into that tradition as well. But I don't think that it was on such a wide scale that would it really, feed into our collective unconscious and make that associated with vampirism. But, again, I think that, there are medical reasons why people were deemed vampires. But for the taking of blood, I don't think that was one of them.
Okay, no worries. We're actually coming to the end of the show. It's been an absolutely fascinating subject. Thank you so much for joining me. Can you tell us where you can get your book again, please?
Well, you could actually go onto my website, because like all the kids have nowadays, I have my own website, and that's simply ronaldmurphy.org. I'm too big for a .com, Carrie, you have to understand. So I'm now a .org. So you can go to ronaldmurphy.org, and you can find my book there. Or you could go to Amazon, and it's called On Vampires. But I also have written 11 other books, so feel free to peruse those books as well, too. I would not hold that against you. Or you could go to centerfor40andzoology.com right in the past year. So I'm looking more for you, Carrie.
Oh, well, I'm sure we'll have to sort something else out.
All right, until next time, Carrie. Thanks a lot for having me on.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us in the chat room. Thank you for listening. I'm actually going to be on holiday next week, so I'll be leaving you in the capable hands of Mark. I'm sure he's going to have a great show for you next Friday. Don't forget, Parasearch Radio is on every single night at 9 p.m. So we have a great week, and I shall see you in a week's time. Good night.
You're listening to Parasearch UK Radio. News, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio.